Good morning, everyone. We are here for an ICA-wide theme session. Also, welcome to the online audience, in case you are there. This panel is titled Diversity in Communication Research, Dynamics and Trends. We have four interesting presentations, starting with Matthew Meier, then it's me, then Dominique Trudel, and Astrid Jansen will close it off. We will do quick questions after presentations in case there's anything for clarification. In case there is no such short questions, we'll have the questions at the end. So I'm inviting Matthew for the first presentation. Ooh. This is a mirror mode. Okay. Let me, because I have notes on here, but I see it's not in presenter mode, so I'm not seeing the notes. Let's see if it's here. Slideshow? Yeah, I forget how it works. And where is it? Left, right? Oh, use presenter view. I see. Okay. You see it? Yeah, I do. There we go. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Let's try that out. What's going on here? Yes. Cool. All right. Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is a really big room for this crowd. I really appreciate you all being here for the 9 a.m. show. I'm really grateful to be part of this great panel and present on behalf of my co-authors, Bengisu Simsek and Louise Maras. We wanted to take this year's ICA theme and apply it to the area of gender research and communication. So we wanted to try to consolidate what research had been done over the last decade and how we might disrupt that research or disrupt how we think about gender as communication scholars moving forward. So that started with trying to ground this in a few different sort of frameworks. First, Robert Craig had argued for a constitutive model of communication, wherein our field is united around communication as the primary mode of explanation. So what that means is that for gender research, for us, just as with hormones for the endocrinologists or the brain for the neurologist, we as communication scholars should be thinking about gender as constituted primarily through communication. Now, Butler argued for gender as something not something one is, but rather something one does. So this is less about self-presentation per se than about the constitution of gender through its performance, how it is encoded and decoded through discursive exchanges and how that gets grafted onto sex as sort of a pre-discursive natural phenomenon, basically. Not to yada yada my way through Judith Butler, but now this is effectively a theory of communication or a theory of gender as communicatively constituted. And so if we take Francois Corin's definition of communicative constitution as the materialization of relations through something, we can think of gender in this way, where one of Butler's arguments is that gender is always relational, right? It's always male versus female, feminine versus masculine. It defines itself in relation to each other. And so this would be the constitution of that gendered relationship through something, particularly through mediated processes, through communicative processes, things like that. Now, this is all sort of a macro view of this stuff, right? And we wanted to try to take that as a lens for understanding this data set, where we went through the 4 flagship journals from 4 different communications associations. This is not at all an indication of impact or quality of these journals. We just chose flagship that were self-identified as flagship because it seemed a way of understanding what associations view as representative of sort of their views as an association, right? And we included special issues in that, but excluded things like commentaries forums, things of that nature. So the first question was how, if at all, gender is analyzed in any of these studies. So that starts with just identifying some gendered keywords, a simple binary coding of are they present or absent, and then and then considering from there for those that have gendered keywords, what was the theoretical relevance of those papers in terms of gender. So we were interested in the extent to which it was meaningfully discussed, with meaningful being operationalized as just a paragraph or more of text specifically about gender. So a 0 is there's no discussion of gender anywhere in the paper. 1 might be a post hoc discussion of it, but nothing a priori. And then 2 is where it's meaningfully discussed a priori. It's part of the theorizing that builds toward their research questions. And then we nominally coded how they included it within their analysis. So as you can see here, the bulk of the results are, 80% of papers showed some gendered keyword, but only 10% of them had a meaningful a priori discussion of gender that built towards their research questions or hypotheses. The majority of studies did not meaningfully discuss gender at all. And so we can just quickly sort of look at what they were doing with it. So examples of this were mostly sort of atheoretical statistics, right? So unsurprisingly, demographic reporting was most common. A lot of papers used it as a covariate. Very few of those with some explanation for why. A lot of it was just standard practice of controlling for certain demographics, and particularly in survey research. And then there's a small chunk that did things like randomization checks, and then chose not to control for gender. So stuff like that as well. For this category of relevance equals 1, where there was no a priori discussion of gender, the bulk of those were ones where gender was included just as one of a handful of demographics that was looked at in a broader way. So gender was included alongside something like age, race, income, and they asked like, how might some outcome of interest differ along these demographic lines? But it wasn't focused on gender specifically. There were some single gender samples for health-related reasons and post-hoc results. And then the LGBTQ section was they were looking at that as a marginalized group, but not focusing on trans youth specifically. So that was our distinction there, was it had to be focused specifically on gendered groups to make the cut for 2. Now, for this level, all these were analyzing gender as a meaningful factor. So what was of interest then is what were the types of gender-related topics that are emerging within these studies? And this was done through an inductive thematic analysis. So we didn't have a set number of topics we were looking for. We just sort of iteratively coded till we arrived at these topics here. Is everyone following so far? Okay. I don't have time to go into all of these in detail. If you're really interested, this is probably a good time to take a picture of this slide because I'm going to move on in a second. But these 7 topics emerged, and as you can see, 2 of them cover about half of all of the studies. So I'm going to talk about those 2 in a little more detail by showing you some of the subtopics within it. But in simplest terms, the top category was broadly about power structures and publics. So the idea was that domain that it tended to focus on was in things like journalism and politics. And it was interested in questions of knowledge production, political participation. So how is political leadership or journalistic credibility coded in gender ways? Or who is afforded the agency to participate or to tell certain stories, or prevented from doing so through discrimination? The second category here of gendered roles and domains was more about the inclusivity of certain spaces, or the roles that people are expected to fill within certain spaces. So family came up a fair amount here of like, what are the expected domestic roles of individuals? How do people negotiate roles within a family along gendered lines? And then there's also the masculinization of spheres like sports or video games, or both within the case of esports, which was somewhat popular. But how do these topics fit within this idea of gender as communicatively constituted? That was kind of the next step of this question, right? And so I want to return to sort of Butler for a moment. and Corinne. And this idea of if gender is constituted through its performance, this is always a dynamic process. This is always multidimensional, right? And so one version of this is how individuals perform their gender to each other, and also how that is interpreted from others. So how it is encoded and decoded by others. This interpersonal level of communication as a gendered process made up a small portion of studies. A lot of these were looking in the domain topic. So it was focusing specifically a lot of time on family and how individuals like negotiate domestic responsibilities, parental responsibilities, things like that. But similar dynamics can also sometimes play out in organizational settings. This can materialize through, gender might materialize here through hierarchies within organizations. And in some cases, that was operationalized within these studies simply through a head count of gender count of people within the organization. Now, as sort of Hanan Bonner noted in the opening plenary, we as an association have agency. We are individuals, right? And so that is another process here where individuals, their own sort of understandings of gender might then influence organizational structures, or vice versa. Organizations can silence individuals. But this was a much lesser explored component of gender within these studies. And it tended to be done mostly through qualitative research that was kind of looking at people's experiences within these organizations. Now, the one that's probably of interest to most people here, or to many people here, would be media. It makes sense if we're talking about communicative constitution as the materializations of relations through something, that mediated content would be one of those somethings within which gender relationships materialize. And in fact, that was a large chunk of these studies we saw. These were content analyses mostly. And we are including mass and mass personal communication within these. So if there's a Reddit subforum that was scraped for its content, but not looking at individual demographics, that's included here too. And then also things like TV content analysis. There were some studies that looked at how organizations kind of shaped content. So how does the demographics of an organization shape journalistic output specifically? But not much going the other direction. I would describe that gap there as what we would see more in audience studies, where the idea is how content sort of produces maybe gender dynamics, say within fandoms or things like that. Most communication research focuses on media effects at the individual level. The idea of how does this content affect an individual's perception of gender, things like that. And that was the other large portion of studies. But of course, gender is also performed in how we select our content, and even more so perhaps how people perform gender in the content they post online, things like that. There was a decent amount about self-presentation in there, and some also about selective exposure stuff, which tended to be looked at, though, through survey research and not so much through experimental research. This is a lot to cover here, so I'm kind of gonna yada yada through. But the one last thing I want to note here is that there's very few that are looking at multiple dimensions, and few that are looking at cross-cultural sort of connections and things like that. So this is a quick overview of what those results are saying, and some of this I've already covered, but it's worth noting that a lot of the stuff is atheoretical. There's a common focus kind of on marginalization within these, which is a really important topic, but there's less focus on sort of the socialization of individuals that leads to that sense of identity that is being marginalized. So how do we identify with that group? There's a little less than 20% focused on intersectional research. A lot of that with human subjects was qualitative, and there's basically nothing in there on trans and non-binary folks and their socialization process. I'm really happy to talk more about this. That is my email down there if you want to reach out. But the things I want us to sort of play with moving forward, first is how do we kind of disrupt this tautology of gender research? So one version of this we could think of is, if we're constantly looking at this as gender as a categorical predictor of something, boys select more hostile media, which makes them more aggressive, then we don't quite get to the origin of how that began, right? It's just sort of recycling the same thing. I don't have an answer for that. That is just the thing that we're grappling with and trying to figure that out. At Mark's panel yesterday, Mike Scheerbacher mentioned a really interesting comment about the mass and mass communication being the audiences. And I want us to think about audiences also in more dynamic ways where they are engaging with each other. And that is part of this constitutive process. Steve Egermountain and Anne Rousseau and colleagues have done really interesting work on interpersonal media effects that I want to give a shout out to because that's part of that process. I'm going to stop now because I'm going over. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, happy to take your questions later.
Also need to time myself, of course. Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Boukes. Should have introduced myself before. I'm an associate professor at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam. I did this research together with Shujun Liu from Cardiff University, Irina from Friedrich, Schiller University in Germany, and Nikki Dekker, who back then was a graduate student in our department in Amsterdam. In this study, we look at 50 years of diversity trends in communication and media studies regarding geographic diversity, gender diversity, and methodological diversity. First, it's important what and how do we look at diversity, and therefore we use the definition of Sterling. And he has 3 elements. First of all, is variety, like within a certain topic or like category, how many different categories are there? For example, if you look at gender, you have male and female, you have 2, but you can of course look at many more different categories in there. Disparity, so in those different categories, how different are they? Later we'll see, for example, geographic diversity. Well, America and Canada, perhaps they're not so different, but America and China, they're much more different. So if you just look at the number of countries, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You need to look at really how different they are. And then thirdly, balance. What is the balance and what's the ideal balance in there? So that's also what we hope to add, is having some benchmarks in this study. The unit of analysis in this research is the journal publications. So we look at how diversity has changed within journal publications, which of course is a certain choice that we made already. For geographic location of the first author, we've tried to first separate between the weird and the non-weird countries. And the weird countries are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And then you have the non-weird countries, which actually are a majority in the world. And we separately look at the US because it's so dominant in our field. We did the same for research subjects. So what is actually being analyzed, what's being studied. And we do this because we see also from the literature, but also from our findings actually, that even if people are not in the US or in a non-weird country, they still often study the US for different reasons, but sometimes also strategic reasons, because reviewers like it more, journals like it more. So people, even if they are diverse in terms of their background, their study might still not be so diverse. Gender, we categorize it as male, female, and other or unknown. And that's because we use a quantitative computational method and we cannot really categorize the third category. And then research methodology, we basically looked at all the different methods that more or less are in our field, but we then recategorized it into qualitative, quantitative, and conceptual work, which is mostly theoretical work only. What we also hope to do with this study is actually looking at the relationships between these factors. For example, a potential increase of female scholarship could go at the cost of the internationalization diversity. Or perhaps does female research lead to more qualitative approaches? These are the research questions that we asked. What is important, like these studies have been done more often, but often very descriptive. And we think, well, we need to perhaps take some more normative standpoint in terms of, well, is this enough diversity and when is it enough? So we needed benchmarks. And that's quite difficult because, well, yeah, where do you start? Like the number of, if I talk about gender, the number of female students, for example, the number of females in the whole population, somebody did that. What we did is like a very conservative estimate almost, so already the people who make it into academia, and we look at ICA memberships. So we got the ICA data from 2023 at that time, both regarding geographic diversity, so where are the countries where people are from, and then we categorize it again in this non-weird and weird countries. And for diversity, we couldn't get those numbers from ICA anymore because they don't ask it anymore. But there are 2 studies which actually reported, which show that about 60% of the ICA members are female. Okay, going to the method. How it began, actually 2 years ago, I think, I presented a manual content analysis on this at ICA. And we did a manual analysis of these factors in general field journals, as E. Watson calls it. These are the journals that are specifically focused on well, not specifically focused, so very general. It could be about political communication, it could be about health communication, it could be about business and PR, etc. But not, for example, political communication, to avoid that we focus on specific subfields in there, because it was manual and we were limited with our budget. We only had 9 journals with the highest impact factor. But once I started writing down, I felt like, well, we are missing a lot here, because if you only look at the top journals, that doesn't really still pay a representative picture of our field. So we continued in an automated way, and we actually scraped the content of all English written general field journals that are listed in JCR and that we could download from EBSCO. So the manual content analysis by now actually turned in more like a validation of our automated approach to actually see, well, the measures that we have in the computational study, can we actually replicate that with the manual content analysis? And some of the measurements, as you often see with automated content analysis, they are not reliable. So therefore, we still rely on the manual coding. These are journals, you cannot really read it, but in case you are interested, I can later look it up. Measurements, national evaluation of the author is very difficult based on somebody's name just to know where they are born. So we actually look at, well, where are they working? So we have 2 clusters. The weird countries are basically the English-speaking countries with British descent. And then we have the richer countries, which are almost all located in Europe with the highest GDP per capita. Then we have the geographic origin of research subjects. In the manual analysis, we basically look at the abstracts and the titles and the methods to just see, well, where was the study conducted? In the automated, we didn't have the full papers, so we relied on a keyword search list of the abstracts and the titles to basically see, well, where do people say in their abstract that a study was conducted? No surprise, many US-based studies don't say that the study is being conducted in the US. So this measurement is not completely reliable if you include the US. So basically what we can only do is have a variable predicting that the study was conducted in a weird or a non-weird country, but not reliable for the US. So we cannot separately look at that. Gender, this actually works surprisingly well. So we scraped the name of all the authors and we just asked GPT to classify it based on gender. There was some previous study actually from another field like physics or something, which also proved that it worked. And also for us, it worked very well. So high Krippendorf's alpha and a high percentage agreement. 6.5% of data could not be classified. And then the method, we basically did the same as for where the research subjects originated from. So we did a keywordless search in the abstracts, which worked very well, except for conceptual papers, because they also don't mention, well, we are purely theoretical work. Okay, the analysis, we relied on multi-level models, basically because all the articles are nested within in journals. Going to the results. Geographic diversity of first authors. I thought this was actually a very interesting picture to see. So we started off in 1975 and the 1980s with a very high proportion of US-based authors, but that declined pretty rapidly. Whereas the weird countries, European and non-US English-speaking countries, and non-weird countries, they increased rapidly. If we compare to the benchmarks, actually, you would see that US members are 47%, but they are even under 40% of the publications now, whereas the non-weird members are only 25%, and they actually go up to 30%. So in terms of this, it seems the geographic diversity has really very much increased. There's just a picture to see how it like visualizes, with the biggest one being the US. After that, you have United Kingdom, Australia, and the Netherlands. Here you actually see also how much our field has exploded in terms of number of publications, which I think is an interesting picture. But so we see a strong decline of US dominance. But if we look at the impact factor, so for all those journals, we of course have an impact factor, we see that there is actually still a very strong impact factor of impact, which basically means that the people from the non-weird countries, they are much less likely to be found in high impact journals, whereas US authors then are more likely to be found in the high impact journals. Geographic diversity of research subjects, I already gave a little bit of spoiler before. So whereas we see that US authors are less prominent in the field, US data is still very often like being employed also by people from different regions in the world, whereas all the others are still kind of marginal. Here again, we also find an effect of impact factor, which basically means that high impact journals are less likely to feature non-weird data. So from the countries that normally are already less present, they're even less present in high impact journals. Gender then, here we see a very rapid increase of female scholarship, which almost comes close to those benchmarks that we see in ICA at least. So coming to 55%, whereas we would like expect based on ICA memberships it to be 60%. So this, I think in a few years we will be there. Here we don't find an effect of impact factor, so female colleagues are equally likely as male colleagues to be in the high impact journals. Methodological diversity, we see a very strong decline in terms of conceptual, purely theoretical work. And we see an increase of both quantitative and qualitative methods, which both have increased, I don't remember, I think 2.5 times. But because qualitative already started out less prominently, this gap only has increased. So even if they both doubled, of course, the gap increased with now a very clear dominance of quantitative methods. And again, no, I think many people will be surprised about that. There seems to be no effect of impact factor on there. And then the interrelationships between them. So firstly, geographic diversity and gender. What we see clearly is that those are negatively correlated with each other. So it is less likely to find female authorship in publications from non-weird countries, and female authors the other way direction are less likely to be found, or no, non-weird countries are less likely to be found in female authored articles. And if we zoom in more, it are mainly US female colleagues that start to become more prominent. So yes, we see more female colleagues in our field, but they are mainly from the US. And yesterday I was in a session of Journalism 25 years old session anniversary, and there they actually found exactly the same. So that kind of replicated. They say, well, yes, we see many more female colleagues, but they say, well, it's just white women. Geographic diversity and methodological diversity, there we actually don't find the relationship. So people in weird and non-weird countries are equally likely to rely on quantitative or qualitative methods. And gender and diversity and methodological diversity, there again we see a clear, well, somewhat clear relationship that qualitative methods are more likely among female first authors. So for males it's 11%, for females it's 16%. And then coming to the conclusion, because I'm also on time, I see geographic diversity. We see less dominance of US authors, but it's still, if they went down, what goes up are the weird countries like me. So in terms of disparity, perhaps we're not that different from each other. So there's still a weird bias with 2/3 of the publications coming from weird countries. And even in that, we see that US data are still dominant. In terms of gender diversity, we have made major steps. We're coming close to the benchmark. A good thing is that we are much more diverse than many of our neighboring fields. So I think that's a positive thing. No effect of impact factor, which is also good. Of course, a side note that it was not possible to, with the automated approach, to look for like other genders than just male and female. And this was not a global trend, so mainly dominated by US female scholars. And finally, methodological diversity, we have much more empirical work rather than conceptual work, but qualitative and quantitative methods didn't increase in a similar rate because the gap clearly growed, and qualitative methods are more likely to be found among female authors. Thank you very much. Any questions? And otherwise, I'll give the word to our first speaker. This is Dominique.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for making it to the 9 a.m. This is great. I'm Dominique Trudel. I'm very pleased to be with you today. The title of my talk is A Dream That Never Came True, the National Society for the Study of Communication in Search of a Center, 1951-1967. As some of you may or may not know, the National Society for the Study of Communication was the name of ICA before the late 1960s, right? So what I want to do with you today is to deep dive into this early history of ICA or NSSC, as it was then called, roughly from its inception in 1950 to the late 1960s. The association was then very, very different from what you're familiar with. Just to refer to Mark's presentation, there were not like that many journals, and gender was certainly not a topic. It was a very small association, a few hundred members, concentrated in the US, in the Midwestern state. Colorado was its geographical center. The annual conference would feature 6 panels, would be organized in some weird motels near Boulder and in the mountains. And the association was then mostly focused on the development of the so-called communication course, which focused on undergrad education, right? It was about developing skills such as writing, speaking, reading, and listening. So quite different from this ICA, which is now focusing on research. So in these early days, it was really not clear what communication was. So this is Elwood Murray, University of Denver professor, who's considered to be the founder of NSSC, who writes, "We had not defined our field very well. There was no generally accepted model of the communication process, and our early efforts were devoted to attempting to make progress in these directions." So basically, the first task of the association was to define what communication was all about. I mean, it was then not very clear. I doubt it's clearer today, right? But the difference is that back then, there was no such thing as communication departments. There were no such things as communication journals. There were no such thing as communication associations. So communication, to put it differently, was a new field. It was a buzzword, communication, an empty signifier that means close to nothing, and that was just replacing controversial terms such as psychological warfare or propaganda that were, not very good fits for post-war US. So in this context, NSSC main purpose was to define and legitimize the new field. It was to set its boundaries with regards to other fields at a moment when these boundaries were far from being established. So today my focus will be on the early effort by NSSC to define and legitimize the field, that is on the boundary work, which served to cope with the disciplinary anxiety that faced the founder of the association, building on very, very thin hair. So I'm going to approach this question through using these twin concepts of disciplinary anxiety and disciplinary rituals. On the one hand, you're having these anxieties regarding the nature of scientific activities, their purpose, claim to knowledge, relation to other scientific fields, their usefulness, and so on. And on the other hand, to cope with these anxieties, rituals, these are activities pertaining to the maintenance of institutions through time and the representation of shared beliefs. Here I'm referring to James Carey's idea about communication rituals. And I'm going to focus on two different projects that serve to cope with disciplinary anxiety, and that can be considered disciplinary rituals. The first one is called the Information Distribution Center, which began in 1951 and ended in 1963. And following up on that, another similar project named the National Center of Communication Arts and Sciences. This is mostly based on archival research. The papers of ICA, which are at Annenberg in Philly, were I draw mostly on that, but also from these other collections, we can discuss that later. But I want to jump right now to the first project I want to discuss this morning, the Information Distribution Center. So when the association was launched in 1950, they were basically having 4 projects: organizing a conference, setting up the Journal of Communication, which started in 1951, setting up the research committees. So the NSSC was made of 15 research committees that were supposed to conduct actual research. And lastly, the Information Distribution Center. So the idea was to gather and index communication research material and to circulate it in the association. So members were invited to feed the center and then to use its resources, right? So it was this kind of gigantic communication research library that they were trying to set up. And I think there's a ritualistic function there. In the sense, well, this serves as mapping the field, right? It provides the field with a history when it has none, right? In the form of published work. It provides the field with a present in the form of a common project, rallying the members, and with a future in the form of future research building on the resource of the Information Distribution Center. So its first director was a man named Francis Cartier, well, Francis Fran Cartier, I'll say it in like American style, who considered, and I'm just going to read this quote, it's so good. The director of the center would soon become Mr. Communication in this country and abroad, for he would be the key to the whole resources of NSSC and more. The nature of the operation makes it necessarily an expanding operation, such as eventually a full-time secretary and perhaps even director would be required after a few years. Didn't work at all, okay? Cartier operated the center briefly, experimenting with punch card and dictaphone, like he would read aloud bibliographies using the dictaphone, so recording, right, and sending the tapes through snail mail to a couple of his friends. That was it. He passed he passed the responsibility. He resigned in 1954 when he moved to Maxwell Air Force Base, Montgomery, Alabama, where he was going to edit the Journal of Communication, which was then based there. So and the service then was transmitted to this man in California, Granville Bazzi. So there's a typo there. And Bazzi was not able to set this up, right? He complained that he was an high school teacher, and he tried to use the mimeograph machine to reproduce material at his school, and he was not allowed. So basically, he disappeared. He stopped filing reports to the association, which was at the same time bragging about the project, in its newsletter. So Bazzi eventually resigned. It was passed against to another person, John Wilcox, here in Denver. So that's John Wilcox, who also faced challenges, was not able to set up the information distribution service as it changed name, complaining that nobody was feeding him material. And when it was the case, like, people were not returning it. So he decided not to lend material, but just to tell people where are the resources. So he turned himself into this kind of one-man world cat of communication research thing, and finally resigned in 1963. And then the service was interrupted, and it was, a source of embarrassment for the association. Like, over 12 years, it never work and accomplished close to nothing. But that story has many turns. And the whole project was reinvented, bearing a new name, the National Center of Communication Arts and Science, beginning in 1965. So 2 minutes, I'm just going to run into this closely. So here you have the launch of the center here in Denver with C.G. Dover, which was then NSSC president, and Edward Safford, an NSSC member, who was the president of the center. So it was a much more ambitious plan. Like, they were targeting to raise $10 million to build this huge computer facility here in Denver, justifying the whole thing with this kind of McLuhanian, explosion of knowledge argument that was in the air. So Safford was himself a convinced McLuhanian and a publishing executive here in Denver. And he wrote in the Journal of Communication in 1967, presenting the center, there must be one focal point in the communications field that provide all of the advantage of a vast interdisciplinary institution, one structure which will bring to the service of knowledge of many varied but compatible fields, one organization which will provide a machinery by which unusual talents and experience can be assembled to solve unusual communication problems. So to put it differently, it was about making communication research circulate in the society as a whole, justifying it by its usefulness, right? So that was the purpose. They never built the center. They moved from little offices to little offices in downtown Denver, one being there at Glen Arm Place. So it's literally one corner from the hotel next to this very good Taco Bell. I went twice, highly suggested. So it was mostly a failure. They were able to organize a few conferences and so on, publishing material. One thing I'm concluding on this that was really striking for me doing that research is how their partners were like the list of partners reads like a who's who of the military industrial complex. So Honeywell provide them with a software called Pattern, so which helped decision making that was developed for the military, connection with Common Corp, NORAD, NASA, and so on, but mostly something that never really lift up the ground. A very good example of what John Peters said. He said, communication is the dream, communication research is the dream of an expanding empire regardless of current size. And I think these two projects show that, the ambitious, the ambition that is completely disconnected from reality. So I'm going to stop here. Please have a look at the digital exhibition. This project was kind of, elaborated in parallel with that. Thanks for your attention.
Yes.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Astrid Jansen, and on behalf of my co-authors, Michael Scharko from the University of Mainz and Sabine Trudel from the University of Hohenheim, where I'm also from, I'm going to present a study on the predictors of publication and citation patterns in communication. So this study has actually been part of a bigger project, which was funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research and was based on an initial study Sabine did together with Laura Lutz on national and gender diversity in communication. And with this project, they wanted to dive deeper in other aspects of academia that also are important for impact. And so the first study they did was on gender diversity at academic conferences at the case of the ICA. And then the colleagues in Mainz also looked at gender differences in communication scientists, Twitter communication, or now X. And now I'm going to present the last study we did on the publication citation patterns. So as research already showed, and which we also have heard from Mark's talk, female publication shares have risen steadily since 2000. However, female authors still remain undercited in relation to their publication output. And this is especially astonishing because we have gender parity in the field, or even a surplus if we look at membership rates at the ICA, as we have already heard. So we can say that women still experience less acknowledgement in the scholarly reward systems. And of course, this is crucial as these imbalances further transfer to academic career progressions, for example. So there has been some research to disentangle these disparities in publications and citations, as you can see here. However, those studies often only focus on single journals or a certain type of scholars, like elite scholars, and they rarely address publications and citations both together, and let alone their interactions, so how they influence each other. And this is what we wanted to try to look at with our study. So we tried to do a field-wide approach with a multi-level analysis of these reciprocal dynamics between publication and citation dynamics to really dive deep into these structural patterns and also disparities in individual career progressions. So our approach is based on two levels of analysis. First, we looked at the article level. We wanted to see how these temporal patterns in female authorships for publications and citations evolved over time. And also we wanted to see how this publication citation gap developed. And then in the second step, as already also Buck has shown, we compared top 10 journals based on impact factors to the rest of the journals. And then we switched to the author level. So we looked at individual careers. And there we looked at the reciprocal dynamics between those publication and citation patterns for men and women. And in the last step, we also wanted to see whether these differed based on the top publishing and top cited authors. So these are the top 1% in each category based on publishing frequencies. So our data is based on articles from 85 communication journals. We have a similar approach to Mark's study, actually. We also selected those based on those journals that were listed in the Sources Citation Index under the category communication. Then we automatically collected those data via API based on the online catalog platform site and OpenAlex, which led to two initial data sets we combined. So publications, we got data from 85 journals, which comprises around 57,000 unique articles from 56,000 unique authors, and an overall gender ratio here you can see which with about 53% of women. And then for the citations, we got data from 80 journals, which comprises almost 507,000 unique articles and from 435 unique authors. And here the overall gender ratio is a little bit different. So we have almost 40% of women authors here in this case. So we then also automatically assigned the gender based on first names, but we use the gender API to do so. And also because in this approach, there's a slightly differential error rate for males. We corrected those by using a method called matrix back calculation. And also Due to this method or automatic gender assignment, we also refer to the binary red gender for the rest of the analyses. So for our analysis, we also ran linear mixed effect models due to the structured nested data structure you can see here. So we have citations nested in publications, nested in journals, nested in years. And for the article level, we first looked at the proportion of female authors for publications and then citations per publication. And for the author level, we looked at counts per year per author. So publication counts per year per author and then citation counts per year per author over the course of the 23 years. And I also have to add, we did not distinguish between author positions. So what you can see first in our results, also similar to what Mark has already said and presented, we see the proportion of female authors in publications, which is the dark green line in this graph, and both publications and citations, so the proportion of authorships have risen over the last 23 years, almost up to gender parity, the numbers that the ICA memberships also resembled. However, what you can also see is that the share of female authors in citations is significantly lower than those of publications. So these are the raw descriptives. And as you can see on the right, this means that the publication citation gap over the last 23 years has not really changed. It remains steady at about 50% difference. And this is already what we found when we looked at our models. So we have an average increase of 0.5 percentage point per year for both proportion of female authors in publications and citations. We did not find a significant change in the gender publication citation gap. And when we looked at top journals versus non-top journals, so rest journals, we also did not see any differences. So these disparities remain across all journals. So then when we turn to the author level perspective, we first see the publication per year per author on the left and the citations per year per author on the right. So the light green line are female authors, dark green are male authors, and the dashed lines represent the top author categories. So publications have also increased individually for every authors. And here we did not see any significant gender difference. So men and women publish at the same rate. But however, men receive more citations than women do when we look at the citations. On average, it's about 0.4 citations more per year for men, so which accumulates almost up to 3.5 citations over the whole period more. And this also reinforces over time, so we have a cumulative advantage. When we then turn to top authors, we also see, first of all, the top authors publish more in general than regular authors. I need to see my notes. Than regular authors. So they publish on average 0.3 papers more per year, which accumulates to almost, actually, I don't know. Yeah, and sorry. And then the difference is even higher for top authors. So here we see that top authors receive almost 4 citations more per year, which accumulates to up to 84 citations more over the whole period. But however, we did not see any significant gender differences here, so which is actually quite nice to see. So women and men, once they achieved this status, you could say they are the same. So what we can take home from this. First of all, increased participation does not equal recognition. So this publication citation gap we see remains consistent over nearly 2 decades, which might refer to a Matilda effect, other studies also found. And we also saw that the individual level factors are the most influential when it comes to impact. So here being a man was a statistical advantage in our analyses. And as we found when we look at it from 2 different perspectives, journal prestige did not really explain those disparities, but those individual factors did. And so what we can take home from this is that the field really needs a rumble with regard to citing women. So we need to break citation patterns in research and in teaching practices by, for example, adapting journal policies, which is already in progress, but also raising awareness also for each one for our own to look at our citations, how and who we cite, maybe by implementing also reporting tools like DiversityX, which we also developed during this project. If you want to take a look up in the corner over the right. And then further, to really unfreeze the gap, we need to reinforce structural support at the individual level. So by hiring, promoting women, inviting them to keynotes, editorships, and leadership roles, because only when women are seen in such positions of power and authority, citing them becomes an unquestioned norm. So thank you for your attention. And if you're interested in getting to know our tool, feel free to join us tomorrow in the tool demonstration at noon. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the room is so large, we have to spread it, right?
All right, questions? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I mean, the partnership, the main one, was with the US Air Force. And the reason, I hope it's better. Thanks for the question. The main partnership was with the US Air Force. And the reason for that was that the US Air Force was teaching the communication course to several thousands of students across the country, and that's in the early 50s. So the Air Force was really concerned and interested in the communication course project, right? That was the main focus of the association. So these connections were really, really strong. You know, I talk about how the journal communication was edited on like an Air Force base in Alabama. But even if you look at the leadership of the association over like for the first 12 years, so from 1950 to 1962, you have 4 Air Force people who serve as president. And I mean, you know, military people who would walk around wearing a uniform, right? So these connections are really not well known in the field and by the members. And since it's the 75th anniversary, I thought that it was a great occasion to dig into this more or less repress history of the field.
Yes.
Of the findings around I think it's more on qualitative data leading towards the then we look at still around the field, the citations were less for the field. And yet they seem to be application for. I'm just wondering what your inference would be around that. Is it that by trying to put the studies more, and therefore because the female are trying to qualitative, then maybe that's why they're interested? Or what would be your reading?
Yes, That's true. So we did not look at the more specific predictors that you mentioned, for example. But what we see in other research is, of course, the topic plays a role because females are inclined, I think you said it, to do more qualitative work. And
I think that might have been Mark's actually.
Mark,
That was-
that was you. I'm sorry.
But it's a
You
small
said
gap.
it?
It's 5%.
5%, okay. But other studies found that, I think Sylvia Knobloch-Westerwick looked at it also, that like topic-wise, there are differences, and also like more niche topics, which females are often drawn to, but also which is also, I think, an intersecting factor, which we did not look at, but should be considered in the future, like more like network approaches, because like affiliations or where you come from, if you start in the US, this really has an impact, as we could see in our dynamics, like the reciprocal dynamics, this really influences this kind of disparities. So I don't know if also like some people suggested, but this is just anecdotal things we talked about, maybe like networks between men are more strong and common. Well, I think there is one study you looked at that, like from Wang and colleagues from 21. Yes, that are more inclined to have stronger networks and push each other. So those are also factors that could contribute to this, which we did not look in this study.
Matthew wants to respond.
Yeah, I think you were thinking of Mark's study when you asked that question. I don't know if I made any direct connection between, I didn't actually look at gender of authors in mind, so I don't really have a sense of that.
And if I can add to that, also structural factors play a role, like maternity leave. And also if you look at length of careers, we see a dropout in some studies of women. So there's those structural barriers maybe that also make it more harder for women to go further on this ladder.
My response would be greatly aligned with Astrid. But I'm actually also sometimes struck by it, but also by the explanation, because if I speak about myself, when I cite the paper, I don't consider whether it's male or female. And so I think there must be something else, which could indeed be the status positions that people have, and therefore they have maybe bigger projects, or they have more money to spend, and therefore they're more likely to be cited. So I think there's all kinds of background characteristics which are different or difficult to like find in the kind of analyses that we are doing. I would find it painful if people cite each other because they're friends and then push each other up. Yeah, maybe people do. I don't know.
Can I add something else? What we also did see, but I didn't mention it, it really also, if you like considering these reciprocal dynamics, if you publish sooner, you get more impact. So maybe like personal characteristics or more risks, maybe females are not as risk affine than men, I don't know, but this also plays a role, like the publication behaviors have an impact on the trajectory of citations as well.
And one last thing to add, I think many people don't even often, especially people who are new to the field, they don't know whether somebody is male or female. And then they always think it's a male, because I have many or several PhD students who all the time say, well, he said, but actually I say, no, it's a she. So then they're still citing them with thinking in their mind that they're male perhaps, but they're actually female. So I think for many people, that's at least an unconscious assumption, which maybe would even work than the other direction. More questions? You first and then you. Yeah.
And we struggle a lot with how we should deal with it. So should we now should we suggest specific theories for the field, or should we more generic gender theory that's used in many other fields, and you now maybe have the broader model to get also?
Yeah, thanks. I want to hear about your study too. I'm curious to see what you found. I think there's a lot of different views on this kind of atheoretical approach. I personally lean towards I think if you don't have a reason to control for something, don't. But I also understand how, particularly in survey research, where they're trying to isolate a specific thing, how that's less practical, you know, but it still begs the question of why are we choosing gender as one of those things? Just because for the most part, those differences are there, but like based on what, right? So yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a tricky one though. But I also think the idea of recycling findings as a justification for these differences is also tricky because these things shift. So, you know, and they're dependent on place and time. So I don't know, that's a little bit of a non-answer, but I think my own instinct is like, let's really think about the theorizing of why we would differentiate, why we would control for, or if there's a methodological reason like randomization stuff. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and it is a proxy for a lot of things, but isolating what we are thinking of it as a proxy for is kind of the key thing, you know, and that's true for any demographic thing. Like, what is the thing we're trying to think about, you know? Because if you lump it all into one category, you're losing the nuance of what we're really concerned with. So, thank you. It's a really good question.
Thanks. Yes. Start with Matthew.
Yeah, so for the like that first round of how gender's included, we trained, so the second author, Bengisu Simsek, and I trained on 20% of the data. So I kind of created some categories a priori and worked with her. And then we adjusted as needed, but the reliabilities were up to, they were pretty good. So that wasn't too difficult. The topics, truthfully, a lot of that iterative process was me. I went through and like we started with like just talking through what those topics were, but we haven't done reliability on that last one yet. So that is, as we move forward with this, that's one of the things we're going to check for is were the topics that I ultimately landed on something that can be replicated, or is it nonsense? So we'll figure that out moving forward. But yeah, thank you.
Astrid?
Yes, thank you for these very important points. And yes, you're right. Those are definitely the points we should look at in future research, like network structures and also like intersecting factors, nationality or national affiliations, maybe also a combination of what you said. And our study is also interesting with the reciprocal dynamics. So our project is at the end, so we finished and we are currently in the review process of this paper. So we have not really concretely planned our next steps, but those would definitely be to consider, yes.
Your question to me was about the computational methods and what were the difficulties. I think the first one, like the geographic diversity, like I can pull out from the system, like where are people from working, but for example, the many Asian people that are working in the US, I cannot see whether they actually are Asian or not. Maybe I could make a combination with the name, but that's what I just think about now. So thanks for that suggestion. And for the others, it's like, if people don't mention it, it's very difficult to detect it, especially in a computational way. Let's say about, especially where the study was being conducted, yes, if people from certain countries are less likely to say that it's from their country, then we cannot detect that. It's also something that I was criticized as a reviewer, like say where you're from and where do you do your study. Gender actually worked pretty well. We also tried the gender API. And we find very similar performance, but GPT was for free, so that was a consideration. Yeah, but there also the Asian names, because often, well, there's not a clear gender. In Asian names, it was also more difficult to detect. And then the method part, that actually went pretty well. And about like making it easier for the future, I think these tools become easier, like GPT, etc., to actually employ. And many studies, and we will also do that, we like the keywords that we use for searching, the dictionaries, they will be published online, so other people don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. Yes. Hmm. Mm-hmm.
In terms of findings, just not replicating themselves. Yeah, I don't know if they're just because there's such an array of topics covered. So like I think of the ones that were in journalism, and a lot of them were finding similar things of here's where discrimination's happening, and that was replicated. But the research where the replication of findings can sometimes be more difficult is when we're trying to think of measures that we think of as like masculinity or femininity, and what does that mean, and how, so like the BSRI came up briefly in different areas, but I can't really answer if what the findings were, because our focus was more on how is it being theorized and used. So yeah, I'm hesitant to give like a firm answer on that, just because I don't really know the results in that way.
Okay. I see no more hands. I see we have 1 minute left. So I want to thank the authors. I want to thank the audience, and have a nice day.